In Belfast, the capital city of one of the provinces of this, our United Kingdom, as everybody here knows, everything, culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, has been very gravely retarded for at least a quarter of a century. At least half a century and maybe more since partition, and before that, because partition is both the outcome and the cause of sectarian warfare in this town, by the simple fact that there are people there who are willing to kill not just one another, but one another's children on the basis of what kind of Christian they are. Horrible things are done, not just in pubs and clubs, but on the streets, on housing estates, on university campuses in that city still, despite the relatively good news we've had today, where the situation remains dominated by barbaric sectarian party leaders. On this and no other basis. Both churches demand that their children are sent to separate schools. They each agree with the other that above all things their own children must be protected from the faith of another faith. I don't think I need to elaborate very much more on how horrendous the consequences of that have been and how they are enshrined, by the way, in our own constitution, which mandates that our own head of the church is also the head of the state and of the armed forces, with all the ludicrous Windsor consequences that you get if you found a national church on the family values of Henry VIII. These conditions, which are farcical in England, Wales and Scotland, are tragic and ugly, only a few minutes flying time from where we sit. If I pass on from Belfast to, say, Baghdad, where I've recently been, and without reopening any of the arguments about the rightness or otherwise of the coalition intervention in Mesopotamia, I think it can be granted by any fair-minded person that what was most needed in Iraq after 30 years of fascism and war was a period of reflection, a short interlude of calm during which Iraqis could look about themselves and decide perhaps whom they'd like to vote, perhaps what kind of country they'd like to live in, what kind of federal system they might wish to evolve, and to do so unmolested by violence or terror. The parties of God have vetoed every hope of that process. The parties of God now have the Iraqi people in their jaws, and they're saying to them, it's not enough just to kill foreigners or to rail against Jews or Christians or secularists. That's nothing like enough. It's only in Iraq, not only, mainly, chiefly in Iraq, that it's considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share, and so on, leaving out at the very bottom, I'm afraid, such forces as Kurds and Armenians, but making everyone defined in their citizenship by their faith.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I just hope that you're doing fine with the review today. So this is Eugene Tech Stories with another video. So I know you might be asking yourself this question. My channel usually revolve around race, but you realize that I'm trying to integrate religion with race together because I'm trying to look at an intersection where the two comes from. One of the most key things that we black people, we need to know that all these things that was being passed down to people, they were not accurate. They were man-made. Later on, we started seeing human beings coming out talking, say that the imperfections of religion, what religion has caused a lot of people. Now, the phrase religion is the opium of the masses was famously stated by Karl Marx. And Karl Marx is an economist who talked about much about capitalism and, uh, the Marxist way, the way he viewed society, and, just everything. So we are having contemporary uh, evolutionists. I'm talking about, um, you know, Christopher Hitchens, and he wrote the books like in his book "God is Not Great," "How Religion Poisoned Everything," which he wrote in the year 2007. He argued that human beings would be better off without religion, and he gave his opinion. I know you'll be asking yourself, Eugene, why bringing this content to us? What value does this add to us black people? There is one thing you need to know. There is this where this point intersects. I'm sorry I've not introduced the video, but I'd like to clarify something. You need to know one thing, that religion was one of the tools that was used to colonize people, to colonize Africa, to brainwash people. And look, white churches created their own churches. They didn't want black people to get in their churches. Later on, turns out that religion itself, it's not perfect. It has its problem. Well, God, the only point that I don't agree with Christopher Hitchens talking about God is not great. For me, I know that there is always a supernatural being, somebody who is always trying to look out for everyone, someone who always protects people, someone who is always there for everybody, because He is our prayers. Some of us, we believe that indeed there is a supreme good, there is a supreme God. So when he says God is not great, maybe if it's metaphorically, but I understand that religion is a man-made thing. Religion is a social control thing. God created religion, but man, human being, the elites changed it and used it to their advantage. Now we are having evolutionary thinkers, people like Christopher Hitchens, who comes out to explain how the world really feels about religion. And I just want you to have an open mind. I just want you to hear what he says about religion. We as black people, we need to know that some of these things were imposed to us. Well, I'm not saying that God is not there. Get me right. I'm saying God is there. But there are some things that we need to question about religion. Also, he's an extremist. Like, he totally says that religion, it got nothing on it. Religion is not good, and all of those things. So I won't say much. I want you to watch this video. I'll be back with my commentary about the same. Let's dive right into the video.
Do I need to elaborate what that's done to retard, to bankrupt, to beggar, to disfigure, and to degrade what could have been an ideally plural and diverse and happy society? Remaining with letter B, shall I say Banja Luka? Shall I say Belgrade? Or just say Bosnia? Again, one of the most civilized enclaves of the Balkans. For many years, protected by a secular constitution and the remains of what had been a secular and democratic republic. And just look what happens when it is decided that it is a matter of faith that determines your citizenship, your allegiance, your identity, your nature, your rights. See the recrudescence in the Europe of the late 20th and early 21st century of Catholic fascist parties we thought we'd left behind at Nuremberg, the Ustasha. The recrudescence of forces like the Chetniks, the Serbian Orthodox fascists who took exactly the same view except the other way around. See the craven way in which our spineless media, which always defers to people of faith, say that it was Serbs who shelled Sarajevo, or Croats who shelled Mostar, when what they should have been saying was, today the Christian Orthodox militia bombarded an open city around the clock, or yesterday the Catholic forces shelled Mostar from dawn till dusk. They didn't do it because it's a matter of taste. We're supposed to respect people of faith, and we're supposed to respect them while they do that and do that and make this sort of excuse. There aren't enough words, in my lexicon at any rate, to express the contempt that I think any right-thinking person must feel for this conscription of this kind of medieval barbarism. Joan will tell me when I've got a minute. I don't know whether I'm yet trespassing on my rivals and my allies' time, but If I was to add Bombay to this list, the city that was very nearly ruined by the sectarian partition of India in 1947, 1948, where once again people were told it's a matter of faith what kind of Indian you are. You may have to become a Pakistani if you're Muslim. You may have to lose your life on the proposition. You may not just be a Hindu. Bombay more or less survived this, the terrifying ethnic cleansing and the pogrom that ensued when the subcontinent was mutilated and maimed and partitioned on this basis in the hopes of a genuine Indian unity and independence, ruined by way of appeasement of people of faith. But Bombay sort of recovered until recently, when now its name has been changed, its minority citizens persecuted, intimidated, driven out by a new Hindu nationalist party, the Shiv Sena, that says that, again, if you do not follow the right God, if you don't accept the supernatural as a real force in everyday life, you are not worth whatever it takes to become or to remain or be treated as an ordinary, democratic, civilized human being in, again, one of the great cities of Asia. Now, it's not part of my case, and I'm sure it's not part of Professor Grayling's or Professor Dawkins's either, to say that religion is the reason for all of this, or the exclusive or sole reason for all of it. I think it would be crude and reductionist to say that. But who is going to argue, I'll be fascinated to see, who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance. I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made, and it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point? And is there anywhere, I'm now going to wind up, is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other B's I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism, or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle, of the principles of Bertrand Russell, who once spoke famously from this platform, of Thomas Paine, of Thomas Jefferson, of Voltaire, and others. And I'll close by saying that I want you to be on your guard against two false issues in this respect, and I'll be very brief. When I mentioned those gentlemen, and I could mention some ladies too in this connection, like Mary Wollstonecraft, don't let anyone tell you that, oh well, secular tyranny is just as bad. After all, there have been fascist and communist dictatorships which have been just as revolting. Fascism, as you know, was supported by the Catholic Church all through its life, and in fact till after it had died, and still is defended by it. One of the leaders of the Axis was actually, the Japanese leader, was actually a god. There's no way of saying fascism and National Socialism in the Axis was secular. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, the same mistake is made, and a religion is made out of man. It's the religious impulse itself that I think we need to oppose, to criticize in ourselves as well as in others. The argument from faith, in other words, the argument from certainty. So those of us who maintain this may not be described, my closing point, as fundamentalists or secularists, as certain cheap and demagogic and opportunist forces have recently been suggesting. We do believe in evidence, we do believe in skepticism, we do believe in reason. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any God-botherer does. But we are open to the argument, and we're going to prove it tonight to you. And don't let anyone dare to imply there's a moral equivalence between us and the fanatics and the fools and those who think they know God's will and can tell you what it is, who are our enemies, and your enemies too. So, I beg to propose the motion that stands in our name. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot more than mine. Yeah.
The motion is opposed by Dr. Nigel Spivey, who is a teacher of classical art and archaeology at Cambridge. His books, which are many, include Songs on Bronze, Greek Myths Retold, and he has done several television series, of which one was called Digging for Jesus. Dr. Spivey.
The proposer of the motion began by saying he was putting the case for atheism. And with respect, Christopher, I'm going to start by saying this isn't a debate about the existence of God. It's a debate about us mortals, the crooked timber of humanity, and how the practice of religion in general affects us. Karl Marx famously described religion as an opiate. Jonathan Miller thinks it's more of an amphetamine, gets people overexcited. And my own meagre religious experience disposes me to think of it as a sort of anesthetic, by which I mean that when I am in situations of feeling lonely, sad, or frightened, I find myself crooning hymns that really relate to the place where we are. They're mostly Wesleyan hymns, but anything really that has the sentiment of Psalm 23 and helps one whistle and sing through the valleys of fear and death. But I'm not here to testify as a somewhat lapsed Methodist, but instead to deliver such academic expertise as I have to offer on this topic. It's brief, has to be brief, but in my view it is so compelling that when we arrive at the conclusion in 6 minutes' time, I'm half afraid that everyone will walk out. And I'd like you to promise not to do that. Otherwise, this will be an embarrassment to the organisers and to ourselves. I'm going to talk about archaeology and anthropology and start with the news from archaeology, the long-term view. Is that a better? As far as we can tell, the species of Homo sapiens roamed the world for thousands of years before becoming, as it were, religious. Something radical happened in our minds, our cognitive systems, about 40,000 years ago. We started to make things for the sake of beauty, not utility. We started painting pictures, carving sculptures. We started using symbols, and that probably included talking to each other, making music, painting our bodies, and so on. This is referred to by archaeologists as the creative explosion. And it's a consensus that there's this kind of grand collective takeoff of our human capacities in the Stone Age, or the Upper Paleolithic to be precise. And one aspect here I think I ought to highlight, which is that one of the features that appears at this time, 40,000 years ago, is that humans start burying each other properly. And they start with these burials to put down flowers, gifts, and other signs of what we take to be some kind of succor or consolation, and possibly a belief in an afterlife. There is some debate about whether our doomed rivals, the Neanderthals, had these sensibilities, but the consensus is that Homo sapiens is a species uniquely hardwired for metaphysics. I've written about this in an understated book called How Art Made the World, and I'm not going to go on any more about it. But this archaeological evidence for the genesis of art, religion, and culture in the creative development of Homo sapiens is not easily discounted. And it sets up an evolutionary pattern. It explains why, I think, when John Lennon or Richard Dawkins asks us to imagine a world without religion, you find your mind wandering, and you're wondering what a world would look like without King's College Chapel, without the Taj Mahal, without Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Sistine Chapel. Venice I've got down here, and I think just about all of Venice qualifies. And you become aware that even while Nietzsche in the 1880s was declaring that God was dead, at the same time you've got Van Gogh manically daubing away out of religious fervour, and a little later on that you find Kandinsky more coolly explaining why this nexus of art, music and spirituality made such an essential and indissoluble alliance for our quest for transcendental satisfaction. And it's why, when I'm asked to imagine a world without religion, it does tend to end up looking like, dare I say, a suburb of Swindon, with the only spire that pierces the sky is the Tesco's clock. Well, we've got a few minutes for the anthropology here as well. Once upon a time, there was a classics don at Cambridge who sat in his study, and he compiled a voluminous series of case studies gathered from around the colonized world about how pre-industrial societies kept up peculiar and primitive practices. So they cowered when the thunder started rolling, they danced for rain, they would copulate in the fields to ensure a good harvest, and so on. It's a literary masterpiece, this work by J.G. Fraser, The Golden Bough, subtitled A Study in Magic and Religion, and in Fraser's words, it set out to chart the long march, the slow and toilsome ascent of humanity from savagery to civilization. Beautifully written, but it's all tosh, and most anthropologists would say so today. In fact, it was not an anthropologist, but another Cambridge individual, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who made some remarks, offhand as it seems, about Fraser's Golden Bough, and pointed out that Fraser's method was fundamentally mistaken. Fraser supposed that savages, these so-called savages, made their sacrifice to graven idols, or they danced for rain, out of ignorance and superstition. But as Wittgenstein argued, the essence of ritual is performance, it's expressive. It's something that you can't gloss with a reasonable explanation. In Wittgenstein's word, we can only describe and say, human life is like this. Have I got time for an analogy? 1 minute, probably not time for the analogy. I was going to tell you about the risks of attempting to react violently to a computer when it does something stupid, which is based on the analogy that Wittgenstein gives of hitting the ground when you're angry. It's not because you think you're going to hurt the ground, it's because you want a release of rage. I will just briefly, incidentally say that it is a very bad idea to hit a laptop. William James, the American psychologist, showed a century ago that there is no logical connection to be made between the fact that our ancient ancestors made errors of scientific reasoning, mixed them up with their religion, and the conclusion that all religion is a big mistake. Logically, that just does not work. If I had another hour here, I'd like to expatiate on the extraordinary phenomenon of how one religion overlaps with another, and how especially the persistence of sacred behavior from the pagan to the classical world is something, the yew trees in the churches, the roots of the cult of the Virgin in antiquity, and so on. But I'm going to end up by saying that around the world, whatever we say here tonight, around the world, the sea of faith rolls on. It rolls on because faith is not some kind of atavistic relapse, but part of our creative and ingenious nature. It's a force by which we humans survive. And the conclusion is that this fact is attested archaeologically, anthropologically, psychologically, and, I dare say, neurologically. And the conclusion would be that for the next hour or so, can I tell you this? In a sense, we are wasting our time debating that we'd be better off without religion. It's not an option. Religion is part of our human makeup, and it's going to be a very interesting time that we spend, but essentially it's not a topic for debate. It's the way that we are.
Brilliant. Well done, Nigel.
Seconding the motion is Professor Richard Dawkins, whose many books I'm sure you are familiar with. The Selfish Gene started in 1976, and there was a torrent of books that followed with wonderful titles like The Blind Watchmaker, River Out of Eden, Unweaving the Rainbow. His present book has no such romantic title. It has a very strong punch to it. The God Delusion was published late last year and was quickly a bestseller and has caused something of a sensation. So I call upon Professor Richard Dawkins to second the motion.
I do not believe that religion is the root of all evil. Thank you, Channel 4. Religion is the root of quite a lot of evil, but that didn't make for a very catchy title. I just want to briefly reply to Dr. Spivey a couple of points. He says we're fighting a losing battle because religion is a part of our human nature. Well, speak for yourself. It's not a part of mine, and it's not a part of the great majority of my friends in universities in England and the United States and elsewhere. He also said, if we had no religion, how would we do without King's College Chapel, the Sistine Chapel, etc.? Well, you know, artists have to make a living, and in the time when the Sistine Chapel was built and its ceiling was painted, you know who had the money. Artists such as Michelangelo had to go where the patronage was. We shall never know the ceiling that Michelangelo might have painted if he had been commissioned to paint the Museum of Science, for example. We shall never know what Haydn's Evolution oratorio might have sounded like, or Beethoven's Mesozoic Symphony. Now, I suppose that apologists for religion would be likely to put forward 4 reasons for believing it to be a good thing, 4 things that religion does for us, and I call them explanation, exhortation, meaning morals, explanation meaning explaining the world, where we come from, where the universe comes from, and so on. Exhortation, what is good, what is bad. Inspiration and consolation. And I think my colleague Anthony Grayling is likely to cover some aspects of exhortation. I shall be brief on that, therefore. Consolation, I often encounter people who say, but if you take religion away from people, how are they going to survive? How are they going to manage when they're bereaved, or when they lose a loved one, when they fear death themselves? And it's a reasonable point. It is certainly possible to obtain consolation from a lie. Many people will say, if you ask them, would you like your doctor to tell you when you have a mortal illness and you're only going to live another 6 months? There are people who will say, no, I would rather my doctor lied to me. And that's fine, and I would respect that wish if I were a doctor, if I thought that a patient wanted to be lied to. But I don't think it's a very dignified, general reason for supporting religion, that it supplies consolation, unless, of course, it's true. And we haven't time to go into it, but I think there are very, very good reasons for thinking that there is absolutely no grounds for believing that there's any actual truth in the claims of religion. So those who gain consolation from religion, I must confess that I rather liken it to a child with a dummy in its mouth. I don't think it's a very dignified, a very respect-worthy posture for an adult to go around sucking a dummy with a comforter, which is what I think it essentially is. Inspiration, well, I've always found the inspiration, the heavens declare the glory of God, all things bright and beautiful, and so on, to be paltry, parochial, small-minded, compared to the inspiration that you can get by looking at the world of science. Deep space, deep time, as the late Carl Sagan showed us. Deep complexity in the study of life. The scientific study of these profound, beautiful, elegant mysteries is one of the greatest achievements of the human spirit. And insofar as religion offers an alternative or even positively stands in the way of scientific activity, then I think we would be well rid of it. Which brings me to the other of my four categories, explanation. In the field of explanation, science has all the cards. Religion used to aspire to a reasonably good hand, but no longer. There is no reason to suppose that any religion, any religious book, any religious teacher has anything to say whatsoever about such questions as where the universe comes from, what life is all about, what life is for, any of those questions, which once upon a time religion provided the best available answers. These are now completely washed up. There is no evidence for them at all. And it's worse than that, because the point I want to end up with is that religion debauches education insofar, and it's quite a long way, insofar as it interferes with the education of children and students. It's not just the teaching of falsehoods, it is that the indoctrination of children in the virtues of faith leads them to be immunized, to be placed on their guard against the enemies of faith who they are told will come. It's as though it's rather like a computer erecting a firewall to prevent incoming information. I have talked to colleagues in America, scientists attempting to lecture to students on their subject, biology, and of course biology makes no sense without evolution. And whenever a lecturer mentions evolution, he sees a great sea of heads shaking, arms folded, and they are not listening. They are trained to give the right answers, they're trained to tick the right boxes when they do the exam, they know how to answer an exam on evolution, but they have been forewarned, forearmed by the firewall of faith. Whenever a teacher says anything about evolution, in effect, stop up your ears. Now that is debauching of education. A quote from Kurt Wise, who is an American geologist. He studied geology at Harvard, no less, under Stephen Jay Gould, no less, and he was set for a good career as an academic geologist, which all his life he had desperately wanted. The problem was, it came from within, it was his religious upbringing, his firewall of faith. And he couldn't reconcile the two, his scientific education with his religion, and he literally got a pair of scissors and went right through the Bible and cut out every verse that would have to go if he accepted his scientific education. And in the end, he decided there was nothing left of his Bible. He therefore tossed out science and said, and from then on, he said, with that in great sorrow, I tossed into the fire all my dreams and hopes in science. And he goes on, I am a young age creationist because that is my understanding of the scripture. As I shared with my professors years ago when I was in college, if all the evidence in the universe turns against creationism, I would be the first to admit it, but I would still be a creationist because that is what the Word of God seems to indicate. Here I must stand. If religion can do that to a highly educated Harvard geologist, just think what it can do to an average school child or student. Thank you.
Our next speaker against the motion is Rabbi Julia Neuberger, who was rabbi of the South London Liberal Synagogue. She's also written many books, of which the most recent is called The Moral State We're In. Julia Neuberger.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all very much for coming. And I'm rather wondering what connection Roger Scruton is going to find with Methodist Central Hall after Nigel Spivey, as I, as a child, as a member of the West London Synagogue, used to come to overflow services for the High Holy Days here. And for those who know about the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a fast day for 25 hours, can you imagine this hall, as full as it is now, with us all fasting and the scent of fish and chips slowly wafting up through the floor? So I have strong memories of my father conducting the services as a lay reader and being here. But perhaps that's not quite the meat of tonight's motion. I'm about as liberal a rabbi as you can be without falling off the edge. Nevertheless, I'm profoundly opposed to this motion. First, let's look at how religion is described. For the perception of religion that we've heard is simply one I largely don't recognise. It doesn't seem to recognise or understand the role of religion in many societies where the question of belief takes second place to how you mark your life events, how you're celebrated at birth and at maturation, how you mark marriage, childbirth, old age and death, how we mourn, how we betroth and how we divorce. Had you asked the members of my old congregation, where I was rabbi for 12 years in South London, whether they believed in a personal God, and if so, what the nature of that God was, they'd have looked completely astounded at you. Many of them weren't believers, as it appears the opposition here, or perhaps I should say the proposition, understands it. They simply didn't feel like that. They weren't certain. For them, the idea that you would have creationism taught in schools would be simply appalling. Unlike people who are confirmed atheists, however, they had doubt, they had uncertainty. At some point in their lives, they had a sense of the other, of a different, superior presence within and beyond them, and on other days their doubts were stronger. But they behaved as if they held a stronger belief. They prayed, sometimes with true humility and piety, and sometimes out of habit, by rote, a bit like Nigel's Psalm 23, which is very comforting in times of trouble. They lived their lives according to the seasons of the religious festivals, celebrating Passover with its message of liberation from slavery, each year recognizing its moral message, but more or less certain as to whether it was divine intervention that caused the liberation at all. They marked the Day of Atonement, asking forgiveness for their sins, some years more, some years less conscious of a divine being that would listen to them. At best, they used this as a day to reflect, and the season beforehand to make peace with those they had offended in the previous year. At worst, it was a ritual recital of a recognition that we all do wrong, and that there's some value in a day of reflection on how we behave, and a form of what I can only describe as spiritual spring cleaning. I make the point to show that not all religion is theologically consistent. Indeed, when the greatest Jewish scholar of the 20th century, Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs, Alav HaShalom, was asked to write a book on Jewish theology for the Catholic publishers Darton, Longman and Todd, he insisted that they called it a Jewish theology because Jews have so many different views and so many different opinions. The old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, isn't in fact a joke, but it's a statement of fact. Belief matters a good deal less than how you live your life. Indeed, the test of the good Jew is what you do and how you behave, and not really at all about what you believe. So one reason I feel so strongly that we wouldn't be better off without religion is that by no means all religion is fundamentalist, extreme, exclusive and damaging. At its best, it's something modest, inspiring and sustaining. The modern division, to my mind, should be seen as that between those full of certainty, who scorn the beliefs of others and have a dogma of their own that allows no real debate, and those who are occasionally full of doubt, but who are tolerant and who are respectful of other people's views. That division is by no means between the religious and the secular. The Crusades, Islamic, Jewish and Christian fundamentalism, fascism and communism are all the results of total certainty. For me, the moderates, religious or not, are the ones who need to unite, and those moderates within the religious world have much to give, to teach, and yes, also to learn. I've lived and worked within modern, non-orthodox, Enlightenment-influenced religious communities most of my adult life. Communities for whom the idea that revelation is a once and forever event is complete anathema, but for whom the idea that we are put into this world with a purpose, however dimly we may perceive it, is a given. With all the passionate rationalism that convinced atheists bring to bear, they miss the experiential, what motivates so many people to do good. It is that sense that we are here for a purpose to make the world a better place that has led so many to social reform that wouldn't otherwise have taken place. It was, for instance...
Christopher, we'll have the questions later, Christopher.
You'll get your turn. You'll get your turn. It was, for instance, religious sensibility that brought us hospice and palliative care. You may or may not share the convictions of those who developed it, but you could hardly deny that in terms of modern health care, the relief of pain of people who are dying has been one of the great advances, one that many really good scientists, desperate to find cures, simply didn't consider. Or take another example, that of slavery, the slave trade and its abolition, the bicentenary of which we're marking this week. Plenty of religious people were involved in the slave trade, and plenty of pretty irreligious people too. But it was the strong religious sensibilities of Wilberforce and his colleagues, largely but not wholly Quaker and nonconformist Christians, that brought an end to the slave trade in Britain. Not soon enough, not humanly aware enough, but as a result of religious thinking from the Puritan tradition on, often profoundly influenced by that Old Testament God that so many people so deride. But they preached, they persuaded, they campaigned, they demonstrated, and they finally got the change through. Or take a more recent example, the Make Poverty History campaign, which had a mixture of people of all ages, races, religions, communities present in Edinburgh nearly 2 years ago, and that has certainly influenced British politicians to give more aid. On those platforms, speaking to crowds of whom many were motivated by their religious feelings, there were imams and cardinals, rock singers and politicians, people of faith and none, gathered together inspired by a cause. The voices of the Hebrew prophets were powerful in the words of the speakers, religious or not, and Isaiah struck a chord amongst people opposed to religious force and form, but passionate about doing the right thing. I'm running out of time, but I want to make one last point, and that's about humility and the religious experience of living ordinary, faithful lives. Working as a communal rabbi, I saw ordinary people trying to live good lives who wanted and want to do the best they can in an imperfect world, to even up inequalities where they could, and to, if you like, try and campaign for social justice. They recognised an obligation to give 10% of their income away to charity each year. Some of them cared for profoundly disabled people, either at home as carers or professionally, giving service because of their sense of purpose. Anything but arrogant. They were bound together by a sense of duty to family, community, and the wider world. They were and are profoundly good people looking for honest ways to live honest, decent lives. In my view, if we didn't have religion, we'd be even more selfish, self-indulgent, certain and cruel, more than we already are. Religious people can without doubt be all those things, but they can at best change the world because they believe in moral purpose, experience a sense of inspiration above and beyond themselves, as many of us do, and inspired by their belief to act. Thank you.
The third speaker for the motion, Third speaker for the motion is Professor Anthony Grayling, Professor of Philosophy at Birkbeck College, author of many books about philosophy, Berkeley, Wittgenstein, Russell, biography of Hazlitt. He also wrote a book called What is Good? The Search for the Best Way to Live, appropriately. And his new book is called Against All Gods. Professor Grayling.
When one gets up to speak this late in a debate, one's a bit tempted to quote that Hungarian MP who, after a long discussion in the Parliament in Budapest, stood up and said, everything has been said, but not everybody said it yet. And it's my turn. Some of you might have noticed the news item today about the Pope Benedict XVI, giving a sermon last weekend in Rome and telling the congregation, reminding them perhaps, that hell is a real place. It's a palpable, tangible place, and the eternal fires of hell really exist, and those who don't accept Jesus, he said, I'm paraphrasing here, will roast eternally, but because of their failure to do so. And this shows how very up-to-date Pope Benedict is, because obviously he's heard about tonight's debate, and this is an intervention. Although I've been trying to work out all day on which side it's an intervention. And is he trying to persuade you to vote, against the motion, or is he actually a fifth columnist on our side of the argument? Well, it isn't clear. Now, I imagine a Martian PhD student. I suppose there are also PhD students from Venus as well, but this was a Martian PhD student who is studying the ethical systems on planet Earth, and has read all the documents, all the treatises, all the philosophical works, the scriptures, the teachings of the Holy Fathers, and has come to the point at which he's got to do some field work. And so he is beamed down by the Martian equivalent of Scotty to Waterloo Station at rush hour, so there are plenty of people about. And he falls into conversation with people having coffee, waiting for their trains. And he asks them a question, actually rather an astute question. He doesn't ask them what they think is right and wrong, good or bad, and why. Instead, he asks them this. He says, what kind of people would you like your children to be when they grow up? And he asks them this because he wants to get from them, to elicit from them, their very best thoughts about the best kind of life. And so he knows that he's going to catch them in a sober and well-judging frame of mind when they think seriously about what kind of people they'd like their children to become. And he finds, when he's talked to enough such people, that there's quite a consensus among them. They say things like this: I'd like my children to be responsible people. I like them to take responsibility for themselves, get an education, get a good job. I'd like them to have a family and friendships, deep friendships, because they're so valuable and enriching. And with their family as well, I'd like them to care for their children tenderly and carefully, and I'd like them to bring up their children to think for themselves and to take responsibility for themselves. I wouldn't want my children to be just always submitting to the authority of, I don't know, a politician or a teacher. Or, I'd like them to be inquisitive and to inquire and to think for themselves. And then the Martian PhD student says to them, it's absolutely extraordinary that all you people say these things about what you want for your children, because this is nominally a Christian country, isn't it? I mean, and isn't it the case that even if you no longer actually believe the tenets of the Christian faith, you are sort of in the position of the young man from Moldavia? You remember that little poem? There was a young man from Moldavia who couldn't believe in the Saviour, so he erected instead, with himself as the head, the religion of decorous behaviour. And this was meant to be, deduced or inferred, at any rate, from the basis of Christian morality. But this nominally Christian country, says our Martian, how can it be that you've said what you said? It's astonishing. Because in the New Testament, you are taught to take no thought for the morrow. Consider the lilies of the field. Don't have a pension. Don't put money aside. Don't educate your children and help them to prepare for a future. Take no thought for the morrow. The lilies of the field don't, and yet you are not arrayed as these. Also, give away all your money, give it away to the poor, and follow me. Then you are going to, if you have possessions, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get into heaven. The eye of the needle, well, we know how that's been glossed in the centuries since, but it just says it's more difficult for a rich person, a comfortably off person, to get into heaven and to pass through the than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. In other words, the teaching of the New Testament ethics, which I would submit to you is not bad as teachings of ethics go. It doesn't really compare to the great systems of Aristotle, let us say, or the Stoics, or of Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is not a religion. It doesn't have any supernatural beings in it. It's a philosophy. Or of the moral outlook of the Enlightenment, or of some of the thinking about the good life, the well-lived, decent and responsible life today, none of which appeal to the existence of supernatural agencies as the source of a divine command. All right, it's not, the Christian ethical outlook is one of the better of those. And yet when you look at it and you see what it demands of you, it is very contrary to the way we think of a decent life now. And moreover, it says, I mean, I can imagine the Martian PhD hearing from his interlocutors on Waterloo Station that they want their children to be happy. Happy, says the Martian PhD student. I mean, it says, blessed are they who weep and mourn. I mean, don't you want them to be miserable so they can get into the afterlife? I mean, it looks as though there's such a radical inconsistency between one of the better religious ethics.
Welcome back, and I hope you really get to see what people think, what people say about what Christopher Hitchens say about religion, because he had something to say about religion, looking at most of the problems that we are having. And you know, one of the major causes of the problems that we are having religion as part of it. So this is his argument. First, he says that religion promotes violence and intolerance. Hitchens argued that throughout the history, religion has been a significant source of violence, division, and hatred. He cited numerous examples where religious beliefs systems have led to large-scale conflict, persecution, and violence. Now, what are the historical conflicts that some has been caused by religion? Hitchens often referenced the Crusades, the Inquisition, religious war in Europe, like 30-Year War, and the partition of India in 1947, which was marred by religious violence between Hindus and Muslims. These examples show how religions have often been the cause of war, used as justification for violence. He also looks back and talks about modern-day terrorism. Under its point, religion promotes violence and intolerance. Listen, he pointed to the rise of Islamic extremism and the terrorist attacks carried out in the name of religion. From Al-Qaeda to ISIS, extremist groups have justified violence by claiming it is sanctioned by religious doctrines. Sectarian violence, still under the same point that he gave. Hitchens frequently highlighted religious divisions that have caused internal conflicts, such as sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Muslims, or Protestant Catholic conflicts in North Ireland. You know, these are just examples, and according to Hitchens, he says that true religion has caused violence. I want you to let me know what you think about this gentleman. Do you think that he's great on what he's saying? No, I just want you to, you know, let me know what you think about it. You know, I just want to know about it. So, somebody, he also goes and gives the second point by saying religion suppresses intellectual inquiry. Now, Hitchens argues that religion dogma often conflicts and suppresses scientific progress and intellectual freedom. He saw religion as anti-science because it promotes belief in supernatural explanation that contradicts evidence-based inquiry. Some key points erased under religion suppresses intellectual inquiry are opposition of scientific progress. Hitchens frequently referred to historical events like the persecution of Galileo Galilei, who was condemned by the Catholic Church for supporting the heliocentric model of the solar system. He also mentioned the church resistant to Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Because when Darwin came with evolution theory, they came with the religious theory that talked about the creation of Adam and Eve, which provided the first account and the second account of creation. Now, creationism and denial of science still under oppression of intellectual inquiry. Now, in the modern context, Hitchens was critical of creationist movement that deny evolutionary biology. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence, he believed that resistance to such stemmed from literal interpretation of religious texts which hampers education and understanding of the natural world. Still the same thing, he talks about faith over reason. According to Hitchens, religion often encourages unquestioned beliefs in sacred text and divine relations, which he believed stifled critical thinking. When religious believers accept claim based on rather than evidence, it discourages inquiry and intellectual growth. Right? Now, the third point that he gave is religion enables authoritarianism. Hitchens was concerned that religious systems of authority often led the unquestioned submission to leaders or doctrines, which would enable tyranny and oppression. He observed, first thing that he observed about religion enables authoritarianism. 1. Theocratic regimes. Hitchens criticized nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia, where religious leaders wield immense political power and impose strict religious laws on their population. In such societies, dissent is often punished severely, and individuals are forced to comply with religious doctrines, even when they infringe on personal freedom. Also, at the same point of religion enables authoritarianism, clerical power in history. He frequently pointed to the Catholic Church historical dominance in Europe, especially during the Middle Ages, when it exerted great control over political rulers and everyday life. Religious authorities, he argued, used their power to suppress dissent, control, to populate and to maintain the status quo. Now, still he went ahead and talks about obedience to the divine authority. That's still under the authoritarianism. Hitchens viewed religious beliefs as promoting a mindset of submission to authority, where followers were expected to obey not just to earthly rulers but also divine commandments. This, he argued, leaves room for questions, resistance, or the individual assertion to their right. Right? So, the fourth point that he gives, he says that morality is innate, not dependent on religion. Well, that's quite tempting. One of Hitchens' central contentions was that human beings do not need religion to be moral. He argued that morality predates religion and arises from human empathy, social cooperation, and rational consideration of consequences. His key points were secular moral system. Hitchens points out that moral codes exist in secular philosophies like humanism, which promotes values such as compassion, justice, and fairness without invoking divine authority. He argued that many moral principles or value, like kindness and fairness, are products of human evolution and our need to live in cooperative societies. Okay. Now, he goes ahead and talks about religious immorality. Hitchens often highlighted the contradictions within religious moral teachings and citing examples where religious doctrines or texts appear to condone acts that are widely regarded as immoral, such as slavery, genocide, or the subjugation of women. He saw this as a proof that religion does not provide a reliable, consistent moral guide. Now, morality through reason. Hitchens believed that, reason and empathy could guide moral behavior more effectively than religious commandments. He argued that humans are capable of rationally assessing the impact of their own actions on others, and that compassion informed by reasons provide a firmer basis for morality than religious teaching that often depends on arbitrary divine edicts. Now, I would like you to tell me, what do you feel about Dr. Christopher Hitchens? Do you think he's right about what he said about religion? Do you agree? Do you not? Do you disagree? I would like you to tell me in the comment section about what you think about this gentleman, this writer, commentator, and an author. So I hope to see you in my next video. These are a little bit different content, but yep, we are here. So as you know, this is your presenter, Eugene Stories, and until then, let's meet on my next video. If you're watching this video for the first time, I'll definitely ask you to join my membership, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me see you in my next video. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.